The radio crackled with static as Ranger Sarah Martinez adjusted the frequency, her breath visible in the cold morning air of the Blackwood National Forest. October had settled over the wilderness like a heavy blanket, turning the leaves into a carpet of rust and gold that muffled every footstep. She glanced at her partner, Ranger David Chen, who was studying the topographical map spread across the hood of their truck, his finger tracing the red lines that marked their patrol route. "Sector 7, David muttered, folding the map with practiced efficiency. "Been closed to rangers for 30 years. Makes you wonder why they're opening it up now." Sarah shouldered her pack, feeling the weight of emergency supplies, flares, and the satellite phone that would be their only connection to the outside world once they ventured beyond the cell tower's reach. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and dance even when there was no wind. She had been with the Park Service for 8 years, but something about this assignment felt different. The briefing had been unusually sparse, the supervisor's eyes avoiding direct contact when he handed them the assignment folder. "Hikers reported lights," she said, reciting from memory. "Voices at night. Could be campers who got lost, maybe some kids playing pranks." David's expression remained skeptical as he locked the truck. "In October, in the middle of nowhere, the nearest trail access is 15 miles from here." He paused, listening to the forest around them. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of a crow and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Besides, if it was just lost campers, they wouldn't need 2 rangers for a 3-day patrol. But they began walking along what had once been a service road, now overgrown with saplings and choked with fallen logs. Nature had begun the slow process of reclaiming the path, and their boots crunched through layers of decomposing leaves that released the rich, earthy smell of decay. Sarah noticed the remnants of old blazes on the trees, faded orange paint that had weathered to the color of dried blood. Someone had maintained this route once, but that someone was long gone. "Tell me about the patrol that went missing," Sarah said, as they navigated around a massive oak that had fallen across their path. She had read the file, but the official report was frustratingly brief. 6 rangers on routine patrol, radio contact lost, extensive search conducted with no results, case closed due to lack of evidence. David was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the forest ahead. "My uncle worked here then. He was part of the search team." His voice carried a weight that made Sarah look at him more closely. "He said they found their vehicles at the staging area, keys still in the ignition, equipment untouched. But no sign of the rangers themselves, not even footprints leading away from the trucks." "People don't just vanish," Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. That's what everyone said. But after 3 weeks of searching with dogs, helicopters, and 40-man crews, they had to admit that sometimes people do. David stopped walking and turned to face her. "My uncle quit the service after that. Said the forest felt wrong, like it was watching him. He never came back to these mountains." They walked in silence for another hour, the abandoned road gradually narrowing until it was little more than a game trail. The canopy grew thicker overhead, filtering the sunlight into a green-tinted twilight that made it difficult to judge the time. Sarah's radio occasionally burst with static, but no voices came through. According to their GPS, they were still within range of the communication towers, but the mountains had a way of playing tricks with radio signals. The first ranger station appeared suddenly through a gap in the trees, its brown wooden structure so perfectly camouflaged that they almost walked past it. The building sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines that seemed to lean inward like spectators at a campfire. Windows stared emptily from the facade, glass intact but covered with 30 years of grime and pine pollen. "Station Alpha," David said, consulting his map. This was the first checkpoint on their patrol route. Sarah approached the building cautiously, noting how the wooden steps sagged under decades of weather and neglect. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. A metal sign beside the entrance bore the faded logo of the Park Service and the words "Authorized Personnel Only" in letters that had been scoured by wind and rain until they were barely legible. "Should we go in?" she asked, though something deep in her gut suggested they should turn around and radio for backup. David was already climbing the steps, his hand resting on the butt of his service weapon. "We're authorized personnel," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, if there are squatters or drug operations in here, we need to know." The door opened with a prolonged creak that seemed impossibly loud in the forest silence. Inside, the station was a monument to abandonment. Dust motes danced in the weak light that filtered through dirty windows, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like forgotten decorations. A wooden desk sat against the far wall, its surface covered with papers that had yellowed and curled at the edges. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their metal surfaces spotted with rust. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating details that made her skin crawl. Coffee cups sat on the desk, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. A calendar on the wall showed October 1994, with several dates circled in red ink. A logbook lay open beside the coffee cups, and when Sarah leaned closer to read it, she saw that the last entry was dated October 15th. "David," she called softly. "Look at this." He joined her at the desk, reading over her shoulder. The handwriting was neat, professional, documenting routine patrol activities in the clipped language of official reports. But the final entry was different, the words pressed deep into the paper as if written with unusual force. "Day 3 of patrol, still no contact with base, radio equipment functioning but receiving only static, team morale declining. Jenkins reports hearing voices at night but no evidence of other personnel in area. Recommend immediate extraction if communication not restored by dawn." The entry was signed by Ranger Captain William Hayes, the leader of the missing patrol. David's breath misted in the suddenly cold air of the station. "October 15th, 1994, he whispered, "the day they disappeared." Sarah turned pages backward in the logbook, reading entries that grew increasingly tense, references to equipment malfunctions, strange sounds at night, and the persistent feeling of being watched. The final week of entries painted a picture of men slowly losing their composure in the face of something they couldn't identify or understand. "We should photograph this," Sarah said, reaching for her camera. But as she lifted it to document the logbook, a sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps on the wooden porch, slow and deliberate, approaching the door they had left open. David's hand went to his weapon as they both turned toward the entrance. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a long moment, the only sound was their own breathing. Then, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the pines, came a voice. "Hello? Anyone in there?" It was a man's voice, calm and professional, with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to authority. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and unease. Relief that they weren't alone in this forgotten corner of the forest, but unease, because something about the voice felt wrong, though she couldn't identify what. "Park Service," David called back. "Identify yourself." There was a pause, and when the voice came again, it seemed to come from a different location, as if the speaker had moved around the building. "Ranger Captain Hayes, Station Alpha. We've been waiting for you." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She looked down at the logbook, at the signature of Captain Hayes, at the date that marked the beginning of 30 years of unanswered questions. David's face had gone pale, and his weapon was halfway out of its holster. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. But even as she said it, she heard the footsteps again, circling the building now, accompanied by other sounds. More footsteps, multiple voices, all speaking in the same calm, professional tone. Station Alpha reporting. All personnel accounted for. Day 3 of patrol, waiting for extraction. Radio contact lost, requesting immediate assistance. The voices came from all directions now, surrounding the building, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she recognized the phrases from the logbook entries. It was as if the words themselves had taken on life, echoing across 3 decades to repeat the final communications of the missing patrol. David grabbed her arm. "We're leaving, now!" They moved toward the door, but as they approached the threshold, a figure appeared in the opening. It wore the olive-drab uniform of a Park Service ranger, complete with badge and name tag, but the face beneath the wide-brimmed hat was obscured by shadow despite the daylight outside. The figure didn't move or speak, simply stood blocking their exit like a sentinel. "Excuse me," David said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We need to get through." The figure tilted its head, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then it spoke, and the voice was the same one that had first called to them from outside. "Station Alpha, Day 3 of patrol. We've been waiting for you." Sarah's radio burst to life with a shriek of static, and through the electronic noise came voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once in that same measured professional tone. Reports of equipment failure, requests for extraction, updates on patrol status, all blending into a cacophony that seemed to come not just from the radio, but from the air around them. The figure in the doorway stepped aside, and Sarah saw with crystalline clarity that there was nothing beneath the hat, nothing inside the uniform, except shadow and empty air. David pushed past the apparition, pulling Sarah with him, and they stumbled onto the porch and into the clearing. But the clearing was no longer empty. Figures in ranger uniforms stood among the trees, dozens of them, all facing the station as if waiting for orders. Some leaned against vehicles that hadn't been there moments before, Park Service trucks from an earlier era, with rust eating through their frames and windows that reflected nothing. Others simply stood at attention, hands at their sides, faces lost in shadow. Sarah ran, crashing through the undergrowth with David close behind, the voices following them like a wave of sound that seemed to echo from the trees themselves. They didn't stop running until the ranger station was lost behind them, and even then, the voices continued, fainter now but still audible on the wind that whispered through the pines. As they paused to catch their breath, Sarah's radio crackled one final time, and through the static came a message that made her blood turn to ice. "New patrol assigned to Sector 7. Day 1, we've been waiting for you." They had been walking for hours, following game trails and compass bearings that led them deeper into the heart of Sector 7, when David's GPS unit began malfunctioning. The screen flickered between their current coordinates and locations that made no sense, coordinates that placed them in areas they had never been, or worse, in the middle of lakes that didn't exist on any map. Sarah checked her own unit and found it displaying the same impossible readings, as if the satellites themselves had conspired to lose them in the wilderness. The sun had reached its zenith and begun its descent toward the western peaks, but beneath the dense canopy it felt more like twilight. The temperature had dropped noticeably since their flight from the ranger station, and their breath came in visible puffs, despite the morning having been relatively warm. Sarah found herself checking over her shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see those shadowy figures in ranger uniforms following them through the trees, but the forest behind them appeared empty, almost aggressively normal. "We need to establish our position," David said, stopping beside a massive boulder that jutted from the forest floor like a sleeping giant. He spread his map across the rock's surface, weighing down the corners with small stones. "According to this, we should have reached Station Bravo an hour ago." Sarah studied the map, comparing it to the terrain around them. The landscape looked right. The same mix of pine and deciduous forest, the same rocky outcroppings and gentle slopes, but somehow felt wrong, as if they were looking at a photograph of a place rather than the place itself. "The compass readings are off," she said, checking the instrument again. "Magnetic north keeps shifting." "Mineral deposits," David suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Iron ore can interfere with compass readings." They both knew it was more than that. The forest around them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that made their skin crawl and their instincts scream warnings. Birds fell silent as they approached, and the normal sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush had ceased entirely. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very air had grown thick and reluctant to move. As they prepared to continue, Sarah noticed something that made her stop dead in her tracks. "David," she said quietly, pointing to the ground near the boulder. "Look." Boot prints in the soft earth, clear and distinct despite the decades that should have erased them. The treads were deep and sharp, as if they had been made moments rather than years ago. But the style was wrong, the sole pattern belonging to boots that hadn't been manufactured since the 1990s. David knelt beside the prints, his expression grim. "Size 11 standard issue Park Service boots." He looked up at Sarah. "These are fresh, but that's impossible." They followed the trail of prints, which led away from the boulder and deeper into the forest. The tracks were methodical, spaced at regular intervals, as if the walker had been on patrol, checking specific locations along a predetermined route. Occasionally, the prints were joined by others, creating a pattern that suggested a team of rangers moving through the area with military precision. The trail led them to a small stream that cut through the forest in a series of gentle curves, its water dark with tannins from the surrounding vegetation. A fallen log served as a bridge, its surface worn smooth by countless crossings. On the far side, the boot prints continued, but they were joined now by something else that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Drag marks," she whispered, kneeling beside the disturbed earth. Something was pulled along the ground here. The marks were human-sized, parallel grooves in the soft soil that suggested someone or something being dragged by the feet. The pattern was consistent with a body being pulled along the ground, heels digging furrows in the earth. But what chilled Sarah most was that the drag marks seemed to go both ways, as if whatever had been pulled had later walked back along the same route. David's radio crackled with static, and both rangers froze. Through the electronic noise came a sound that raised goosebumps on their arms, a rhythmic tapping, like Morse code, but with a pattern that seemed almost musical. The sound continued for nearly a minute before fading back into static. "Could be interference from the minerals," David said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Or atmospheric conditions." They pressed on, following the stream as it wound deeper into the valley. The forest grew denser, older, with trees that seemed to predate human settlement in the region. Some of the pines were massive, their trunks easily 6 feet in diameter, their canopy so thick that virtually no sunlight reached the forest floor. In this perpetual twilight, their flashlights created pools of illumination that seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding darkness rather than pushing it back. It was in this cathedral of ancient trees that they found Station Bravo, but not where their map indicated it should be. The building sat in a depression beside the stream, as if the earth had slowly swallowed it over the decades. Only the roof and upper walls were visible above ground level, giving it the appearance of a structure being consumed by the forest itself. "That's not right," Sarah said, consulting her map again. "Station Bravo should be on high ground, a quarter-mile north of here. But there it was, unmistakably a ranger station despite its sunken position. The same brown wooden construction, the same official signage, though the words were harder to read from their elevated position on the stream bank. What disturbed Sarah most was that the building appeared to be in perfect condition, despite being partially buried. The visible portions showed no signs of weather damage or decay, as if time had simply stopped around the structure. They descended to the station level, using exposed roots and rocks as handholds. Up close, the building was even more unsettling. The windows glowed with a soft, warm light that suggested occupied rooms within. But when Sarah peered through the glass, she saw only empty rooms filled with that same yellowish illumination that seemed to come from no identifiable source. The door, like the one at Station Alpha, stood slightly ajar. But unlike the previous station, this one hummed with activity. They could hear voices inside, muffled conversations that seemed to ebb and flow like tide. Occasionally, a laugh would emerge from the building, followed by the sound of chairs scraping against wooden floors and the rustle of papers being shuffled. "Hello!" David called out. "Park service! Anyone in there?" The sounds inside ceased immediately, as if someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the voices had been, pregnant with the sense of people holding their breath, waiting. Sarah pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The interior was fully furnished and appeared to be in active use. Coffee steamed in cups on the desk, and a logbook lay open with an ink pen beside it, as if someone had been writing just moments before their arrival. But the room was empty, and the air carried that same chill they had felt at Station Alpha. The logbook drew Sarah's attention immediately. Like the previous one, it contained patrol entries, but these were more recent, dated within the last few days. Her heart pounded as she read entries written in different handwriting, all reporting routine patrol activities in Sector 7. October 13th, Day 1 of patrol, all systems normal. No contact with outside personnel, but radio equipment functioning within normal parameters. The entry was signed by Ranger Martinez. Sarah's hand trembled as she turned the page and found another entry in David's handwriting. October 14th, Day 2 of patrol. Some equipment malfunctions noted, but nothing outside normal range. Team morale good. Weather conditions optimal for continued patrol. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look at this." He joined her at the desk, and she watched the color drain from his face as he read his own words in his own handwriting, describing events that hadn't happened yet. The entries continued, documenting their patrol activities for days into the future, describing discoveries they hadn't made and decisions they hadn't yet faced. The final entry was in Sarah's handwriting, though she had never written the words. October 16th, Day 4 of patrol. Contact lost with Station Alpha, requesting immediate extraction. Strange phenomena reported by all team members. Recommend Sector 7 be permanently closed to patrol activities. This is our final transmission. Underneath the entry was a note in different handwriting, in letters that seemed to have been pressed into the paper with unusual force. Patrol terminated. Personnel transferred to permanent assignment. Station 7 now operational. David's radio burst to life with that same rhythmic tapping they had heard earlier, but this time the pattern was clearer, more insistent. As they listened, Sarah realized it wasn't random interference at all. It was Morse code, spelling out a message that made her skin crawl. WELCOMETOSECTORSEVEN. The tapping stopped, and in the silence that followed, they heard footsteps on the roof above them, slow and measured, as if someone were pacing back and forth. The steps moved from one end of the building to the other, paused and then returned, creating a pattern that suggested methodical surveillance. Sarah grabbed David's arm. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they turned toward the door, it swung shut with a sharp bang that echoed through the small building. David grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. The windows, which had been clear when they entered, now showed only darkness beyond the glass, as if night had fallen while they were inside, though Sarah's watch indicated it was still afternoon. The footsteps above grew louder, and they were joined by others. Soon it sounded as if an entire squad of rangers was walking across the roof, their boots creating a steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with Sarah's heartbeat. Through the ceiling came voices, multiple conversations occurring simultaneously, all using that same calm, professional tone they had heard at Station Alpha. Day 3 of patrol. Radio contact established. All personnel reporting for duty. Station 7 operational. The voices grew louder, and Sarah realized they were coming not just from above, but from all around them, from the walls themselves. The building seemed to be speaking, channeling the voices of rangers who had walked these forests decades ago and had never left. David drew his weapon, though Sarah couldn't imagine what he intended to shoot. The voices weren't coming from people exactly, but from something else, something that had absorbed the memories and echoes of the missing patrol and was now playing them back like a broken recording. The logbook on the desk flipped open to a new page, and words began appearing in Sarah's handwriting, forming themselves as if guided by an invisible hand. October 13th, evening, trapped in Station Bravo. Experiencing phenomena consistent with previous reports. Recommend no further patrols be assigned to this sector. If anyone finds this record, stay away from Sector 7. The forest remembers everything. Sarah watched in horror as her own hand began moving toward the pen, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist. She tried to pull away, but her muscles wouldn't respond to her commands. Her fingers closed around the pen, and she felt her hand being guided across the paper, writing words she had never thought. We understand now. The forest needs us. We choose to stay. The words appeared in her handwriting, but she had never formed the thoughts, never made the decision they described. Around her, the voices grew louder, more welcoming, as if celebrating her acceptance of whatever fate awaited them in this forgotten corner of the wilderness. David grabbed her arm, breaking the strange compulsion, and pulled her away from the desk. The door had somehow opened again, revealing not the forest they had entered from, but a long corridor lined with more doors, each marked with a different station number. The corridor stretched into darkness, lit by that same sourceless yellow glow they had seen in the windows. They ran toward what they hoped was an exit, passing door after door, each one slightly ajar, each one emanating voices and the sound of activity from within. Station Charlie, Station Delta, Station Echo, names from maps that shouldn't exist, patrol stations that had never been built or had been built and then forgotten, erased from official records along with the rangers who had staffed them. At the end of the corridor, they found a door marked Exit, but when they burst through it, they emerged not into the forest, but into another ranger station, this one filled with equipment that belonged to no era they recognized. Radio sets with vacuum tubes glowed beside computer terminals that displayed text in green phosphor, while filing cabinets built into the walls contained records that seemed to stretch back for decades. And behind the desk sat a figure in a ranger uniform, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat brim. He looked up as they entered, and when he spoke, his voice was exactly the same as the one that had first called to them from outside Station Alpha. Ranger Martinez, Ranger Chen, you're right on time for your shift. The figure behind the desk stood slowly, and as he did, Sarah noticed that his movements were too fluid, too precise, like someone who had practiced the same gestures for decades. His uniform was immaculate, pressed and cleaned, as if he had just reported for duty, but the fabric itself seemed wrong. Too dark in some places, too light in others, as if it existed in a different spectrum of light than the rest of the world. Captain Hayes, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. You've been missing for 30 years. The figure tilted its head, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the hat's shadow. Not a face, exactly, but an impression of features, as if someone had tried to sculpt a human face from memory and had gotten the details almost right. When it spoke, the voice came from somewhere else entirely, perhaps from the walls themselves or from the air around them. Missing, The thing that had been Captain Hayes laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "We've been here the whole time, maintaining our posts, protecting the forest. You're the ones who went missing, abandoning your duties for 30 years. Sarah looked around the impossible station, taking in details that defied explanation. Maps on the walls showed Sector 7, but the geography was wrong, twisted, with mountains in places where valleys should be and rivers that flowed uphill. The windows showed views of different seasons simultaneously, spring rain outside one pane, autumn snow outside another, as if the building existed in all times at once. "This isn't real," she said, more to convince herself than to challenge the entity before them. "You're dead. The patrol disappeared. The search teams found nothing." "Death," Hayes repeated, and the words seemed to echo through dimensions they couldn't perceive. Such a limited concept. "We discovered something better. The forest showed us a way to serve forever, to be part of something larger than our individual existences." David's hand remained on his weapon, but Sarah could see the futility in his eyes. How do you fight something that might not exist in any conventional sense? How do you escape from a place that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space? Through the station's windows, Sarah saw movement in the forest beyond. Rangers in outdated uniforms moved between the trees with purposeful strides, some carrying equipment she didn't recognize, others simply walking patrol routes that led nowhere and everywhere. She counted dozens of them, then hundreds, all moving with that same fluid precision as the thing behind the desk. "Every ranger who ever served in Sector 7, Hayes explained, following her gaze. "Every patrol that was assigned to protect this wilderness. We're all here, all still on duty, all part of the Eternal Watch." A new voice spoke from behind them, and Sarah spun around to find another figure in a ranger uniform, this one female, her badge reading Ranger Patricia Collins. Sarah recognized the name from the missing persons reports she had studied before accepting this assignment. Collins had been the communications specialist on the original patrol. "You felt it, didn't you?" Collins said, her voice carrying the same hollow quality as Hayes. "The moment you entered Sector 7, you felt the forest watching you, evaluating you. It's been calling to you for years, through every tree you've protected, every trail you've maintained, every visitor you've guided safely through the wilderness." Sarah realized with growing horror that Collins was right. She had felt something during her 8 years of service, a connection to the forests she protected that went beyond professional duty. There had been moments when she was alone on patrol, when the trees seemed to whisper to her, when the wind carried messages she almost understood. She had attributed it to her love of nature, her commitment to conservation, but now she understood it had been something else entirely. "The forest needs guardians," Hayes continued. "Not temporary caretakers who retire after 20 years and forget their responsibilities, but eternal sentinels who become part of the wilderness itself. You've already begun the transformation, haven't you? You felt the pull, the desire to never leave these mountains again." David shook his head violently. "No, this is insanity. Sarah, we're getting out of here." He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward what appeared to be another exit, but the door opened onto a corridor identical to the one they had fled from, stretching into the same sourceless darkness. "There is no leaving Sector 7, Collins said gently. "Not once you've accepted the assignment. Every ranger who enters here becomes part of the patrol. We tried to resist at first, just as you're doing now. But the forest is patient, and eventually we understood that this is where we belonged." Sarah's radio crackled to life, and through the static came voices she recognized. Her supervisor back at headquarters, search teams being dispatched, helicopter units being scrambled to look for the missing rangers. But the voices were wrong, distorted, as if they were coming from very far away or very long ago. Day 4 of search operations. No sign of Rangers Martinez and Chen. Last known position was Station Alpha. but teams report finding no evidence of their passage beyond that point. Extend search perimeter. These rangers know the wilderness. They wouldn't just vanish. Weather conditions deteriorating. Recommend suspending aerial operations until visibility improves. Sarah looked at her watch and felt her sanity slip another notch. According to the display, only 6 hours had passed since they had first encountered Station Alpha, but the radio reports suggested they had been missing for days. Time moved differently in Sector 7, she realized, flowing at its own pace, according to rules that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. "Don't you see?" Hayes stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of pine needles and decay, as if the thing wearing his form was composed of forest materials rather than flesh and blood. "You're already part of the search reports, already missing, already lost to the world beyond these trees. The only choice now is whether you accept your new assignment willingly or fight it until the transformation happens naturally." Through the windows, Sarah saw that the forest had changed again. Where moments before there had been rangers moving between the trees, now she saw hikers, families with children, solo backpackers, all walking through Sector 7 with the same purposeful stride. But they wore modern clothing mixed with outdoor gear from different eras, as if every visitor who had ever entered the sector and failed to leave had joined the eternal patrol. "All of them," she whispered. "Everyone who went missing in these mountains." "Not missing," Collins corrected. "Found, given purpose, made part of something eternal." David tried his radio again, desperately cycling through channels, but all he received was static, punctuated by those same search reports growing fainter and more distant. Sarah realized that they were hearing their own disappearance being documented, listening to the official record of their transition from living rangers to permanent residents of Sector 7. The truth hit her like a physical blow. They had never left the first station. Everything that had happened since their encounter with the shadowy figure in the doorway had been part of the transformation process, the forest's way of gradually introducing them to their new reality. The hiking, the stations, the logbooks, all of it had been preparation for this moment when they would finally understand what had happened to the original patrol. "You can keep your memories," Hayes offered, as if reading her thoughts. "Your personalities, your relationships with each other. Nothing has to change except that you'll never grow old, never tire of your duties, never lose your love for the wilderness. Isn't that what every ranger dreams of? Eternal service in the place you've devoted your life to protecting." Sarah looked at David and saw her own realization reflected in his eyes. They had been recruited, not by the Park Service, but by something far older and more patient. Every ranger who had ever felt that deep connection to the forest, that sense of belonging among the trees, had been marked for eventual service in Sector 7. But there was still a choice to be made, and Sarah discovered that she retained enough of her humanity to make it. She thought of her family, her friends, her life beyond the forest, all the connections that defined her as more than just a guardian of the wilderness. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't accept this." Hayes nodded, as if he had expected her answer. "Then you'll fight it, like we did, like they all did. But the forest is patient, and in the end, everyone finds their way home." The station began to dissolve around them, walls becoming transparent, furniture fading like morning mist. Sarah and David found themselves standing in a clearing she didn't recognize, surrounded by trees that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The sun was setting, though moments before it had been afternoon, and stars were becoming visible in a sky that shifted between seasons. Their radio crackled one final time, and through the static came a voice Sarah recognized as her own. "This is Ranger Martinez reporting for Station 7. Day 1 of permanent assignment. All systems operational. We're coming home." "Duh." But she hadn't spoken those words, and the realization that her voice was being used without her consent filled her with a rage that burned away the confusion and fear. She grabbed David's hand and ran toward what she hoped was the edge of the clearing, toward trees that looked more solid, more real than the others. Behind them, voices called out in farewell, dozens of rangers wishing them luck, telling them they would be back soon, that the forest would welcome them when they were ready. The voices followed them through the trees, growing fainter but never disappearing entirely, as if the forest itself had learned to speak with human tongues. They ran through a wilderness that shifted around them like a living thing, past stations that appeared and vanished, over streams that flowed in impossible directions, under a sky that showed different times of day depending on where they looked. Their GPS units spun wildly, their compasses pointed in directions that had no names, and their radios provided only the voices of people who should have been dead for decades. But gradually, imperceptibly, the forest began to feel more real, more solid. The trees stopped shifting, the streams followed normal courses, and the sky settled into a proper sunset that painted the western horizon in shades of orange and red. Their equipment began functioning again, showing coordinates that matched their maps and radio frequencies that connected them to the outside world. When they finally stumbled onto a real trail, one maintained by living rangers and used by actual hikers, Sarah collapsed with relief. They had escaped Sector 7, but she knew with absolute certainty that their ordeal was far from over. David helped her to her feet, and together they made their way back to civilization, following trail markers that led them away from the heart of the wilderness. But with every step, Sarah felt the pull of the forest behind them, a magnetic attraction that seemed to strengthen rather than weaken with distance. The trees whispered her name when the wind blew through their branches, and every shadow seemed to hide figures in ranger uniforms, beckoning her to return. They reached their truck as full darkness settled over the mountains, and Sarah had never been so grateful to see a piece of machinery in her life. The engine started on the first try, the headlights cut through the darkness with reassuring normalcy, and the radio immediately picked up chatter from other ranger units conducting routine patrols in safe, mundane sectors of the forest. But as they drove away from Sector 7, Sarah caught glimpses in her mirrors of lights moving through the trees behind them, and she knew that Captain Hayes had been right about one thing: the forest was patient. It would wait for them to return, because they would return. The assignment to Sector 7 had not been random or routine. They had been chosen, marked, recruited, for a purpose that transcended their individual lives. The official report would state that they had encountered equipment malfunctions and gotten lost for several hours before finding their way back to the main trail network. There would be no mention of the stations that shouldn't exist, the voices of rangers who had been missing for 30 years, or the logbooks that documented events that hadn't happened yet. Sarah and David would be praised for their professionalism in a difficult situation and rotated to different assignments, far from the mountains that had tried to claim them. But late at night, when the wind blew through the trees outside their windows, they would hear voices calling to them across the darkness. And sometimes, when they checked their equipment before heading out on patrol, they would find extra items that hadn't been there before. Compasses that pointed towards Sector 7 regardless of magnetic north, maps that showed trails that didn't exist, radios programmed with frequencies that connected them to stations that were supposed to be abandoned. The forest remembered them, just as it remembered every ranger who had ever served in its depths. And Sarah knew that eventually, whether in months or years or decades, she would find herself assigned to patrol Sector 7 again. The next time, there might not be an escape route, or she might not have the strength to resist the call of eternal service. But for now, they were free, driving through the night toward headquarters, toward paperwork and debriefings and assignments in sectors where the only voices in the wilderness belonged to living things. Behind them, Sector 7 settled back into patient watchfulness, its stations staffed by rangers who had found their permanent posting, its trails patrolled by guardians who would never retire. And deep in the forest, in a station that existed in all times and no time, Captain Hayes updated his logbook with a new entry. Rangers Martinez and Chen have completed orientation. Status: assigned but not yet reporting. Classification: pending return. The forest will wait. The entry was signed with his name, but underneath, in handwriting that belonged to no one and everyone who had ever served in Sector 7, appeared a final line. Welcome to the Eternal Patrol. Your real assignment begins when you stop running. Sarah would find those words written in her own logbook when she returned to her quarters that night, in her own handwriting, documenting an assignment she had never accepted and a fate she had not yet embraced. But the forest was patient, and time moved differently among the trees, and sooner or later every ranger came home to the wilderness that had called them to service. In Sector 7, the patrol continued, as it always had, as it always would, until the last tree fell and the last mountain crumbled into dust. And somewhere in that eternal watch there would always be room for 2 more rangers who had glimpsed the truth of what it meant to truly serve the wilderness, and who would one day stop running from a destiny that had been written in the rings of trees and the flow of mountain streams long before they were born.